Star date. Anyway. Hey, it's Chris. What are we talking about today? Captain's Chair, Star Trek, right? In the Imperium vibe, Horizons, Legends, and Classics, we now have a very similar deck building system with more complexity in the Star Trek universe. What do I think of it? And does it improve on its predecessor or previous namesake? Well, let's go. Let's talk. So full disclaimer, background here at the beginning. I have a copy of Imperium Legends sitting right behind the camera. I'm not a big fan of it. I think, ever since I got it, the rule book has been the biggest barrier to entry. I did not think the rules on the first time around were very good. It's a very complex system of the maneuvering and the mechanics as a deck builder, which is significantly heavier than traditional deck builders in the first place, as you're either playing solo or head-to-head competitive, trying to reach the end game faster or better than your opponent. Now with Star Trek here, you're getting 6 different asymmetric decks utilizing the similar mechanics of the deck build from the marketplace and the locations that you are going to be maneuvering and gathering from in that way. It's a heavy gamer's race, if that makes sense, because the actions, the mechanisms themselves are rather straightforward, but the potential for analysis paralysis, given the plethora of options that you have on a turn-by-turn basis and the cards that you are drawing to manipulate all of the forces on the table, are going to leave you somewhat pondering. And so if you're like me and you like to take your fast turn quick off the top of your head, it's not a problem. But if you're a heavy analysis, figuring out the most optimal every time, this game may be a lot slower for you to play. And again, truth be told here at the beginning, right? It took me 4 games of playing this to actually get through it without making too many rules mistakes. So it is significant in the learning curve. The game goes until you reach one of 2 endgame victory conditions. One of them, I have an incident deck right here that is full of incidents. And you are going to be both taking these as well as contributing to this deck as you go along. And these are basically bad things because each of them, coincidentally, gives you -2 points at the end of the game. If you ever run out of these, the game ends immediately. And the person with the most of them in their area, deck, all, loses. It's just that straightforward. However, the other end game, which happens more frequently, if I can actually locate it here, front and center, you have basically your star date log, and you go through that, gathering glory off of it through a, I believe, 5-card system here that you just have, and as you make your way through each of these cards, it triggers sort of a cleanup refresh of the general market in the general area. And then the last one triggers the end game. And these cards are progressed by putting glory tokens on them in the lower left-hand corner here. 5 to start out that I had alongside here. And that means whenever you're, well, grabbing glory, obtaining glory with your actions in the universe, you gather it from these cards. And that's one of the biggest rules mistakes that's already being talked about in the forums, is if you don't do that, this game will drag on forever. The other big rules mistake that I ran into, just as a little side note here, is at the end of the round, you also take one off and place it on one of the market cards to incentivize, well, market grabbing, but then also to speed up the end game in that way too. Now, how are you doing this on a turn-by-turn basis? Well, the basic setup here is, well, not really basic in front of me. You can see that this is a relatively big space hog on the table, even with one player, because you're still setting up, I didn't even do it for this example, the bot or the second player that you would be having simultaneously on the other side over here. Because what you've got going on here, as you can see along the bottom here, is locations that you are going to be trying to take control of. You have your market of the 4 different types of cards, the people, the cargo, the ships, and the allies. And then on the side, I already mentioned the incidences and the encounters. Encounters are sort of the opposite of incidents, and I've got them face up just so you can kind of see them. They're superpowered cards, and they might be super powerful abilities, or they might be just super powerful in terms of endgame victory points, because this one in particular is a great example of that. You've got a wild card encounter, and it says this card can't be played, but it does give you 8 victory points in the lower right-hand corner here in terms of the endgame scoring. And when you can't play it, that means if you draw it in your hand, you can't actually play it. And that's the main action we'll talk about here as we go through the 4 phases. But you can do other things. You can discard it. You can essentially beam it to places. And beaming, again, is one of those mechanisms that you don't really have a clue what it's going to do or how it's going to be helpful until you start playing, because like I said back at the beginning, right, this game is a race. So I have to take a half step back before I run you through the 4 phases, because otherwise they're not going to make any sense. And even the setup here is a little bit more complex. I've got my advanced locations that are sitting right here, my 3 starting locations. The rest of the starting locations get put off to the side. What you're going to be doing is you're going to be sending your away teams as well as your ships, although in this case it's actually the bird of prey here from the market. So in case I need to draw that one's right there. But then, you know, each of the individual decks for your various commanders will have 3 of their own unique ships with their own picture on the back of them, and they will be utilized going to these locations, warping there, usually either at cost or with a little bit of freebie. And then you are going to be having your main deck. And the deck is broken up into really about 4 parts. And I don't even have enough space here to actually even show you what a situation would look like. But essentially, you start out with your captain and your ship. Both of these will start out deployed. These cards have a couple different aspects that we can talk about here as an example. Again, because the most basic understanding has to be obtained from what is shown on this card. Reaction means if it's sitting out there, that's a passive ability. It's going to have as a captain how many away teams that you actually have that you can send, right? How many red shirts can you afford to lose, essentially? But then the end game scoring is also unique for each captain. Then on the ship side of things, you'll notice in the upper right-hand corner on both of these, they have a lot of different symbology and keywords that is going to be represented actually by this whole flowchart of all of the other ones in the main deck that you can keep track of. But that's going to play into some of the actual cards you're going to be using along those lines. Then on the left side, a few of the insignias or the symbols that are represented on your player board, which we'll talk about later. And then you get to the bottom part here, which is the main core of the second phase. And that is you have the play action, which can be done as many times as you want, but anything with the blue play action, you get 3 of those actions per turn. Activation means it's out there, it's deployed. Deployed means staying out there. It doesn't mean you've played it on your turn. That's the main differentiation. It takes a little bit to get used to. And activation just means tap, essentially, right? Turn it to show you've exhausted it, retap it, untap it at the end of your turn, rinse and repeat. So in this case, USS Enterprise here allows me to spend one of the 2 currencies here. This is being one of them. This little gold bars being the other, to warp it to a location. Then discard a card to beam a card here, and then promote a person in my hand to duty officer, because as the ship's bridge, you can have one other person, because all of your people are going to have basically a playability in some shape or form here, and then they're going to have something else potentially, or even 2 things down here at the bottom. Most of the asymmetric cards that start in the decks are going to have abilities, but some of the other ones, for the example in this one, came from the actual market and has a resupply, which we'll talk about in a minute as part of one of the main other phases. Then you have the deck, and the deck is where you're drawing from. You draw 5 cards off of this deck on the beginning of every round. And so these cards all actually have the word available at the bottom, and that means that they start in this deck. However, after I put my deck down here, you can see I've also got another little deck above it in that way as well. And this is made up of 2 different things, and this is where the race part comes in very heavily. I have a reserve that are face down, shuffled, placed crosswise above my development cards. And normally you'd probably actually have your development cards splayed out so you could kind of see the different costs of what they are at the bottom. And those are going to be cards that you're going to be paying the cost for in order to recruit them into your deck at a later point. So here you can start to see the costs of what each of them are, but these cards are in the way, and you can't buy these cards until you get rid of these cards. And these cards also are your reserve cards, like I mentioned, and these again are a little bit more powerful. The development cards are the most powerful. And so these cards, the reserves, are actually going to be obtained like this anytime you cycle through your deck. You get to take the top card off of your reserve, and this is the great part about this game as a deck builder. I love this feature. Favorite feature as a whole is that you get to decide whether you want to discard it or you put it on the top of your deck. And both actually have significant advantages because there are a lot of cards that allow you to get cards from the discard. So it actually might be easier for you to get this super powerful card from the discard rather than from the top of your deck, because there's going to be a lot less that potentially allows you to draw, if that really kind of seems backwards if you're used to some other deck builders where that is not always the case. And then once these are gone, so once I went through my deck 4 times and I had all these reserve cards, then when I go through my deck again, I can start buying these cards individually with those 2 resources that I mentioned. And all of these, as additions to your deck, are going to give you victory points. All of the market cards are going to give you victory points. You're going to have missions that are going to give you victory points. All of the locations are going to give you victory points. All of the encounters give you victory points. The incident cards give you negative victory points. And your individual goals, 3 of them, those are the sort of the pseudo missions that I mentioned, also give you not really necessarily victory points, but significant bonuses. And that goes into the side of things that there are 2 sides to each captain, not an evil and a good, but a 1 goal and a 3 goal, more asymmetry as a whole. So you put this back out above your deck. I've got these 2 sitting in the deployed area. And then the last area that I'm going to talk about here is the locations. Like some of the other cards or even captains allow you to send the away team to locations, whether there are ships there or not, whether there's a specific keyword or things along those lines to allow you to go there. And locations are gained and you control them when you have more forces there at the beginning of your turn. You have to have at least 3, a combination of 3, and at least 2 more than your opponent. Well, the great thing about this is that if you get one of these locations, it goes over on your side of the board, and it's going to give you icons, it's going to give you keywords, it's going to give you control, and you get this control basically as like an immediate effect. But then some of them will also have resupply effects. Some of them will also have activation effects. All of those sorts of things that we'll talk about in a second that will make sense once I go through the 4 phases. But then once you put one of these out, you refill so that you always have 3 of these locations sitting out there. And if somebody else actually had troops, ships, away team there, and you got rid of them, well, you're going to get the card. They're going to get the glory. They get glory for the glorious Ragnarok, or, if you want to compare it to that or something, right? So you're not just getting screwed, essentially. So it's a nice balancing act in that regard. Then we have the market, which I briefly mentioned, the 4 different areas. And so the market is also something slightly different that we have to talk about as well, because you're going to be having a couple different keywords that allow you to manipulate that. And that's probably the biggest thing I'll say a little bit more at the end, is that some of this keyword terminology, again, is part of the issue with the learning curve. It's just not as intuitive, right? Find means, well, finding it potentially from your own deck. And scanning means that, well, if you scan for 3, you can choose the top 3 cards, but then you can also take the, market card that's face up. But otherwise, if it just says gain, then you just have a choice between the face up one or the mystery face down one. And those are the dynamics. Again, it's not a huge thing, but it's just not, you're trying to keep it straight always as you're trying to do that, because you're trying to do it along the way. And the keywords in this game are extensive. We'll put it that way. Okay, preamble over, right? I wasn't kidding about the complexity of this game. So then the 4 phases of this game. The first is resupply. You're going to have cards essentially with this person, for example, that says resupply, gain 1 of the gold bars for each cargo you have in play. So you're going to be playing and deploying cargo, because you're going to be deploying things, which means they're out there forever, essentially, almost. Not really, though. But then you're also going to have cards that you just play on your turn, that after your turn is over, they get thrown into the discard pile. So you resupply. Anything that's green, essentially, on those cards, resupplies. Then you go to the control. You go to these 3 areas and you take control of anything that may have been under your control. If you've got the ships and the away personnel, to take one of those, and then you would take the control bonus. That is the first 2 phases. It sounds relatively straightforward. It is relatively straightforward. We'll talk about why it's also not a little bit later. The third phase of things is the main core of the phase, right? I have my 5 cards. I'm looking at my 5 cards and I'm going, okay, what do I want to do with these 5 cards? Did I really just draw 5 directed cards for the example here? Oh, good job, Picard. And so we'll show you some of these other ones, but essentially all of these have multiple options, most of the time, at the bottom, where you're going to have the ability to do this. And so in this case, each of those blue icons, you can choose 1 play action per card. But that icon there, blue icon, means that you have these little blue things, and essentially it's to help you keep track of it, but you have 3 of these. And so when you play something with this, you put one of your 3 on it to remind you. Now, you can earn a couple of these extra on an individual turn, but you lose them after the turn, so it's not like you gain a 4th action for the rest of the game and you're just OP and your opponent's screwed. But they're all going to be things that allow you to manipulate all of these areas that we've already mentioned, which is why me going through all of those other areas is so important to understand the dynamics at play. Put a card on the top of your deck to gain a person. So again, gain, you either get the card from the face-up market or the top card face down. Take an incident card to gain an ally. Well, I've already told you that the incident cards are bad. Why would you do that? Well, allies are hard to get. Picard, for example, gets 1 point at the end of the game for every ally that I want. So, well, you're going, Chris, well, I would gain a point to lose a point because you said the incident's already worth 2 points. But there are lots of these other cards that allow you to, well, get rid of incidents, because that's what you're going to be doing. Because if it's just take an incident, take an incident, take an incident, this deck would run out really quickly. But you're going to have the ones that you're grabbing from this deck, but then also the ones that come in each of the decks as well, that you're going to be having flow back and forth, because they're not bad. For example, right, let's just show you, just so you know I'm not making stuff up, right? Use a play action, spend a gold to return this card. You may refresh a ship. So they're not really all that bad. Play a card, put a card on the top of your deck to return this card. You may promote a person from your staging area to the duty officer. So they all allow you manipulation in just different ways. Kind of eating up a turn, maybe going giving you a half combo instead of a full combo, if you want to look at it like that. And then these other cards are all going to be, you know, different manipulations of those mechanics as a whole, right? This one is the only card that really allows you, the Strange New Worlds, to get one of those encounters. But the tricky part with this one is that select a controlled location, meaning a location that I already have. Not one of the neutral ones out here that both of us are throwing our personnel at. One of the ones I already have, and make sure I have an away personnel and a ship there. Then I can grab an encounter. But I have to log this location wherever one I chose, and also to gain a glory. Now, logging is the other thing. Logging is your culling. Logging means you take this card and you put it under your commander. And also, there are cards, in Picard's case, that will actually get you more glory, resources, or bonus points, victory points at the end, depending on how many are under there at any one point. And that is the fine-tuning of it, along with beaming. Beaming your cards, in these cases, to, say, you know, the Enterprise, to get some of these. And it helps you winnow that, because again, like I said, it's a race. The more you get through your deck, the more I get these reserves that are better and faster, stronger, more combolicious, the more I can buy into the development cards, the more I can get to the encounters, the more glory I get, the faster I trigger the end game before my opponent. That's what you're doing on a turn-by-turn basis. Now, some of these other cards, we'll pull up Picard's 5 other cards here, for example, so you can see what some of these other ones look like. I should have had this one out, actually. This says available. This one actually is Picard's starting location as well. So in this case, play, take control of it. So I already can get a location to start out with. And activation. So as I mentioned, activate means this is out there. It's a passive. I can tap it. If I have an away team there, draw a card. If I have 3 or more there at a location, draw a card. And then you have your personnel right here. We already talked about some of the directives. You have Worf here. Play. Take an incident card and discard it. So that means I'm taking it from the pile and throwing it right in my discard. And then discard the top card of my deck. So I'm burning a card from my deck, which is, again, usually not a great thing, but I'm burning through my deck faster. So that's great. Send 2 away team to a neutral location. If he is out there, this is where this bottom activation comes in as the duty officer, in his case, as well as Riker's, right? Attack activation, and this is where you're going to be doing the main interaction. It's some take that, depending on how and what faction you want to be, is going to have it to a varying extent. Also, some of the cargo, some of the other allies, some of the other personnel that you can recruit are all going to have different parts of that, as well as, I mean, even the ships, right? So from a thematic incorporation, you can see that here. You know, let's pull up the bird of prey and compare, right? Attack, warp this ship. You may spend 1 resource to force your opponent to recall a ship, meaning they have to take it back from a location that is already at, and take it back into their deployed area, I believe. Activation, discard a card to beam a card here, and then discard a card to remove an opponent's away team from a location where you have one, if you do gain a glory. So again, the glory, though, is coming from this card right here, and this is the winnowing game timer, as I already mentioned. So those are the things that you're dealing with dynamically. And then, if I did get that bird of prey, then I would just put another card back out there immediately in place of it. And at the end of those rounds, basically it allows you just to scut this whole market to refresh it all, which is, again, very, very nice. It keeps the market very, very refreshed and strong and going in that way. And so that's the dynamic of the game in a nutshell. So pros and cons then, right? I know he said there's a brief overview, but you have to understand a little bit more in depth these different areas and how they're going to be interacting. And again, it's not going to click the first game probably, because you're going to be spending too much time in this thing. Because again, let me show you, for example, the keywords here at the end of the rule book, right? You're like, oh, that doesn't look that bad, Chris. Okay, 1 page right here. And it's giving you like 3 or 4 examples on all of these keywords in detail. Then 2 more pages right there, and 2 more pages right there. that's a lot of keyword pages with all having to differentiate the differences and the nuances and the errata that can kind of go along with it. So it's not as straightforward. That's why I said at the beginning of the video, it took me 4 games to really, right, to know what was going on and to be able to actually manipulate this in the right way and not make too many rules mistakes as I'm going along as well. Now, you want to know the good stuff and the bad stuff, though. That's why you're watching this part of the video. The good stuff is that this is a solid freaking game, right? This is a really good game. But I got to put a few caveats on that. The learning curve is significant. It's not super easy. If you are just vaguely familiar with deck builders, or you like the idea of deck builders, you're going to be like me when I was looking and trying to learn Imperium the first time around, and it's going to fail. And you're going to feel really frustrated. And I felt very frustrated my first 2 games learning this and trying to do it. And so that is a real potential. If you're looking at Imperium and you're going, okay, I learned that, no problem. Again, you probably won't have as much or hardly have any issue, because you've got like 5 pages of errata keyword explanation at the back. It makes the front end a lot harder to learn when you don't really understand all the edge cases. It again reads a little bit more like we've played this game and we're writing the rule book because we've played it, rather than if you just pick this up, it's going to be really, really straightforward to learn. So it's going to have a little bit of a barrier to entry from that aspect of things. I can't discount that, even as someone who plays as many games and learns as many games as I do. The decks themselves are asymmetric, they're dynamic, and you can see the strengths and the weaknesses. But the nice thing about it is they're all adaptable to the circumstances in front of you. And so it's not just, this is my deck, this is what I do, right? Picard, like I showed you, has a lot of ally manipulation. And so he really wants to do that. He really wants to, put some entries into his logbook. Star date, anyway. But if you can't do that, if the cards you're getting out here in the market aren't allowing that much manipulation, the game gives you plenty of room to pivot and take advantage of it as a clever gamer, rather than pigeonholing you into, if the right market cards don't come out, if I don't deck draw my right cards at the right time, I'm not going to, no, that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. The better person is going to win. The other part I didn't mention, which, ties into a little bit of the blessing curse, is this game can extend a lot longer than what you think. This game, with the dismissing of your troops, your ships, because when you take control of those locations, as I was talking about, the neutral ones, any ships or away team you go there actually get dismissed. And so your away team go back to your captain, but your ships go back in your discard. So you have to get them back out and deploy them back again, as opposed to just, having them back, to the fleet and then warping them back out and back and back and back. So things like that. And the individual turns of having, a mix of these 5 cards on a turn-by-turn basis, and having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different play actions right here, let alone any of the play actions I could have out on the other controlled cards, or the other cargo cards, or anything else that is deployed in the first place. You are going to have basically a gluttony of excess of which combination and which order. And that's the other thing I found myself doing is, playing two-handed. I said, oh, shoot, I should have done this in this order, right? Grab the incident card, then put the incident card back, right? Buy the ship card from the market, and then play the card that allows me to manipulate the ship card to be played for free from the discard pile after I search it. So things like that, you're going to start to see clicking as you're going along. And again, like I mentioned earlier, I love the aspect of gaining the cards, whichever ones they are, from wherever, and having this actually both really good, clever option of putting them in your discard, as I just mentioned, grabbing things from the discard shortly after you do that, or putting them on the top of the deck, guaranteed to draw it the next time, period. And so which of the better aspects can you do? Which mitigates a lot of my issues and concerns with deck builders in general, when you're going, okay, which one am I going to get? Am I going to get the, please give me the right set of cards. Please give me the right combination. No whammy, no whammy, no whammy, no whammy, stop. No, you don't have to deal with that, because this allows you to mitigate it in that regard, which I just love. And truth be told, right? This makes me actually want to go back to Imperium and try Imperium out again, right? because I know the rule book with Horizons has been said to be, you know, written better, and it makes me want to go back and try and learn that. And that in and of itself right there is an accomplishment, because I had sworn that game off like over a year ago. Okay, back to this game though. What are my concerns? Again, the analysis paralysis is significant. There is the potential, and this is where the expansion content would be coming in, and I think that this is where I might zig where other people are zagging, because you've got a lot of people talking about, well, I don't have this captain, I don't have this character, I don't have this from this Star Trek. You know, I'm going to sidestep you there for a second. I think the 6 asymmetric decks are great, but the market that I have in front of me right here, you can't see it on the overhead, so let me pick it up for a second right here, right? So I have a lot of person cards. I have a fair number of cargo cards. I have lesser of the ship cards. I have least, I think, of the ally cards. And so that would be actually where I go. Similarly to, I have the least amount of the encounter cards. I'd like more encounter. I'd like more ally. I'd like more ship. I'd like more cargo from those aspects of things. And so that's really where I would like to see it. I don't need a couple more of those decks, but you can keep that market going, because, you know, our last game, we got through all of the ally deck. We got through almost all of the locations because we were just massively controlling for locations. And so those things really, you know, got steamrolled. So I could use a few more in those categories. Even with the decks dynamically different, having them all have these different missions and goals that you're achieving that I didn't even talk about, again, giving you victory points, and all dependent on some of these tracks potentially that I didn't talk about, with the 3 different areas you're going to be slowly upgrading your skills in, which is not only going to play a role in sometimes the goals, but also the individual points on some of these cards in the first place. For example, at the bottom, you can see that this one actually has a question mark, meaning you get that money points based on how far your tracker is up along the bottom here. So if it's down here, they're worth 1 point, then 2-point modifier, 3-point modifier, 4-point modifier. So these are, again, are going to play into it, but your overarching strategy may not go into that as well. And the glory that you're getting off of these cards, again, I worried that this game was going to overstay its welcome. None of our games have ended in the instant burnout so far, right? But all of them have ended with the glory being taken off of these cards, which happens very quickly once you start to get your engine built. You start getting 2 or 3 glory a turn, and, you know, it's 5 glory on this card, 7, 7, 6, 5, which sounds like a lot. But, you know, if I take 2 or 3 off on my turn, you're taking 2 or 3 off in your turn. That's a whole card right there, potentially. And then you're taking 1 off to put on the market at the end of your turn as well. Like, it really goes a lot faster. So when I said earlier that this is a race, it is a race. Can it overstay its welcome? Only because of player decision making as a whole. You know, and if you're looking for a little bit of thematic incorporation, truth be told, I'm not a Trekkie, right? I was always on the other side of the star fence, if you know what I mean. But there is some thematic incorporation, right? You've got Deep Space Nine sitting right here. You know, Deep Space Nine can't warp. It stays in your deployed area, period, and gives it a couple different activation abilities that you're going to be able to utilize slightly differently than all of the other decks accordingly. So there are nuances like that from people that know the lore. So if that is also your concern, I think it's well served not knowing a whole lot about it in the first place. That being said, am I turned off by it? Am I turned more on by it? No, I think it's just a really, really, really good designed game. And so that's why I can easily say that regardless of the theme. I think, again, sort of like I talked about earlier in the year, right? Like, theme is never a turn off for me, but really good thematic incorporation can elevate or boost a game as well. I talked about it with Mind Clash's Ironwood earlier this year, where just the integration of the mechanics and how each asymmetric side worked with what the overarching thematic incorporation was at the same time, it was, you know, and this is, you know, very similar. It feels reminiscent of those aspects, even with my little knowledge base that I had to go, you know, look up because then I was curious on some of this stuff too. You know, falling in the Wikipedia hole and all, right? The other pro that I have to put out there as well is that I like the fact that this is a burning racing game in that way. I thought this was going to be a slow slog back and forth, the clever and creative way to burn through your deck as fast as you can in order to optimize those combos while still, you know, racing through it to get the better cards incorporated to beam out the cards that you don't want clogging up your deck or logging them in the first place, giving you 2 ways to manipulate and fine tune it to, you know, a very, very well-oiled machine is, again, tremendously surprising. But it's going to take you a couple games to start to see some of those elements. It's going to take you a couple games with an individual asymmetric deck to start to go, okay, this is how my engine needs to run. And when you start pairing up against other players, how their manipulation or their attacking or the market that has behooved them with the ability to disrupt your plans, that's when the gaming starts. Am I happy with this? Actually, this exceeded my expectations, truth be told. So, and again, I say that as someone who did not like Imperium originally whatsoever, and now I am forcing myself to potentially go back to it to try it out again. So that's how I feel about it in that way. So this is probably one of the most mechanically sound games, period, I have played in 2024, right? I have no qualms about telling you that. I have no qualms about saying, wow, this is, mechanically speaking, just incredibly, incredibly well done. Am I going to keep it? This is heavier than I play normally. My wife would not like this game. This is too convoluted for her, as you know, she would call it, right? And so I don't know. I have a feeling I will now, actually. And I wasn't planning on that when I initially got it, but it's really grown on me in that way that I go, I'm thinking about it afterwards, which I was not, again, expecting to have it remain in my craw and eat away at, oh, that was kind of interesting. What if we did that next time? What if you did that? And that is a great test of a game too. Now, other side disclaimer here, I didn't play solo. You have to go watch someone else and hear someone else talk about solo. So I'm sorry for all you solo junkies. The only thing I can say is that I have a rule book here for the main, and I have a whole nother rule book here for the solo. And so there are some differences. There are some nuances between the bot solo that you're going up against and the individual player turns. And I can't speak on it much further than that. And I can't speak on how different it is overall, like comparatively. I just know that if I play games and I have different number player counts that I'm playing a game at, I like the game to be very similar at all player counts with slight differences rather than feeling like it's a different game. I can't say that it's this case, but hopefully, if for all you solo junkies, you guys can check it out and see if this still works as well at 1 player as it does for 2 for me. So there you go. That's all I got. Stay classy. Wiz Kids, thank you for sending it to me, and have a great freaking day. Peace out. See you around.